I'm afraid this is not going to be a proper scientific talk, but just an overview of several questions in which we are interested in that are more related to the general top of this grant. So we work on spores, sporulating organisms. We work on the developmental biology of spore-forming organisms, and we are at the IQE, and I showed you this picture before. So that's just a recent photograph of the group, and several of these people have been involved in the work I will describe to you in the next minute. So that's just a general picture of a culture of Bacillus subtilis, a sporulating culture. It's a model organism, very sophisticated genetic tools. There's a mother cell, and inside the mother cell, you get differentiation of a different cell type called the spore. At the end of the process, the differentiation process, the mother lyses to release the spore in the environment. And the spore is really a rock. It's made to last. It's metabolic dormant. But in spite of the fact that there's no metabolism in the spore core, which houses one copy of the genome, several of the proteins that compose these outermost layers of the spore, and some of them are resolved in this SDS page here, are active enzymes that are continually monitoring the environment and looking for signals, metabolic signals to initiate spore germination. And so without spore germination, there's no establishment of a population of cells capable of growing and colonizing, if we're talking about organisms that colonize the human gastrointestinal tract. So just quickly, the sporulation consists in different morphological transitions, all of which have been characterized. We can do, so we know that the genetic determinants that force progress through these morphological stages. And the process is controlled by RNA polymerase sigma factors that act in a cell type specific fashion. And that's exemplified here. For example, SIGG activity is only detected in the forespore, the future spore, at a late stage in development, and sigma K activity is only detected in the mother cell at a late stage in sporulation, as shown here, with promoter fusions to SIGG and CK responsive genes. So one thing in which we are really interested in is this. Gut spore-forming bacteria are very prevalent in the human gut. So Trevor Lawley in 2016 challenged this notion that most of the bacteria in the human gut cannot be isolated in pure culture, because he realized that people were just using the wrong conditions for cultivation. In fact, if you use anaerobic conditions, a rich medium, and importantly, molecules that trigger spore germination, then you can cultivate a lot more organisms than was possible before. And about 60% of the bacterial genera in a healthy individual produces spores. And so the idea is that sporulation is an essential function of the microbiota. It is important for colonization, infection in the case of a pathogen, persistence, and transmission, because most of these organisms are anaerobes, strict anaerobes, and the spore is oxygen resistant. So some of the important species are here, Ruminococcus, for example, and Blauthium. And there's a big diversity in the kind of spores they form. And so we were interested in that question. How diverse is sporulation in the human gut? And one approach to this was just to make a phylogenetic tree in which we're just looking here at the presence or absence of the 4 cell type specific sigma factors that control spore differentiation. And I will just, so usually or normally, at least in the model organism Bacillus subtilis, as I just showed you, you need 4, 2 in the mother cell, 2 in the fourth spore. But just look at this organism here, Ruminococcus. So it's very prevalent in a healthy humans as a spore former in the gastrointestinal tract. It only has one sigma factor. It's a 4-spore specific sigma factor, suggesting that this organism, if it forms spores, and apparently it does, it's gonna produce a spore in a very different way from the dogma, the model. And so we are interested in what triggers sporulation and spore germination in the human gut, and how these spores of these different organisms that are prevalent in the human gastrointestinal tract, they interact with the host. Okay. So for these organisms, which presumably are symbionts, beneficial bacteria, there's really no very good genetic tools to manipulate and conduct genetic studies. But this is an oversimplification, I'm sure, but one of the big differences between a pathogen and a symbiont, or at least a commensal, in what concerns spore formers, might be that these guys here produce beneficial molecules, and the pathogen will produce toxins. And so a model organism for sporulation by a pathogen in the human gut is Clostridium difficile. The spores are ingested, they will germinate in the intestine, they will colonize the anaerobic colon, and importantly, they germinate in response to bile salts from the host and other molecules. And then a vegetative population will be established that produces the toxins. The toxins cause damage. Spore shedding will complete the cycle. So we've been interested in analyzing Clostridium difficile because it is a pathogen, but also because it's going to provide us with tools to analyze at least the function of some of the conserved genes that we will find in the commensals or the symbionts of the human gut. And so difficile is really a major nosocomial pathogen these days. It causes many deaths and infections per year in the US and in Europe, and a huge economic burden in the healthcare systems. And this is mainly because of high recurrence rates. So up to 25% of the cases of C. difficile infection can lead to recurrence of the disease, and this is followed by other cases. So it's basically an infectious disease that has features of a chronic disease. You get the bug, you will keep it for the rest of your life. So the way it works is that the risk of Clostridium difficile infection increases during antibiotic therapy because of dysbiosis. So that's what breaks the colonization barrier and allows C. difficile to expand. You stop antibiotic treatment, the risk of CDI comes down as the microbiota recovers. The problem is that if you do this in mice, for example, and they never see spores again after this first cycle, anytime or every time you give them antibiotics again, they will develop the disease. And that's because the spores are persistent in the host or in the immediate environment in the form, and the organism is persisting in the form of spores, microcolonies or biofilms, and spores can be made in microcolonies or biofilms. Okay, so the spores are important for transmission, persistence, and disease relapse. And one of the things we are interested in doing, so this is differential gene expression in different parts of the colony. Sporulation genes are expressed in the older parts of the colony. The matrix producing genes are expressed in the bulk of the colony here. And that's important to maintain the biofilm together. And the genes involved in motility are expressed at the edge of the colony, and we are interested in things like, for example, imaging mass spec to see what metabolic exchanges occur at this area that induce growth of the colony, the biofilm, and affect gene expression in other parts of the colony. So the other thing that in which metabolic interactions with the host is important is this. So this is the cluster of genes that codes for the two main cytotoxins produced by difficile, TCD8, TCDB. And we're looking at the single cell level of expression from the promoter of a regulatory gene, this one, that controls the expression of these two genes. Obviously, you see expression with a fluorescent reporter. You see expression in vegetative cells, but you also see expression during sporulation, specifically in the fourth spore. So this gene, in fact, codes for a sigma factor, which is autoregulatory, which may explain this bistable switch. Not all the cells express the toxic genes, but expression from this promoter for this regulatory gene is responsive to a number of regulatory proteins that monitor the metabolic state of the cell and also of the host. So there is metabolic control of toxin production, and we are interested in that. Just as an example, this is a mutant for a regulatory protein and a congenic wild type. And you see that for this particular mutant, which responds to the availability of amino acids, in the wild type, you get a fraction of the population expressing the gene, and you get a certain intensity of signal on average per cell. But in the mutant, you get a lot more cells in the population expressing this gene, the toxin genes. In fact, we're looking at the expression of this gene here, coding for toxin A. And the signal per cell is also much higher. So we're interested in the interactions with the microbiota and with host cells that control the behavior, the activity of regulatory proteins that sense metabolic signals and impinge those into control of toxin production by sporulating cells. So coming back to the Bacillus model, I just wanted to give you another example of something in which we are interested in. It has to do with metabolic control, but has nothing to do with toxin production or anything like that. So at this intermediate stage in sporulation, the fourth spore is completely isolated from the outside medium. And it's separated from the cytoplasm of the mother cell by a system of two membranes. There is an intermembrane space in between. That's the fourth spore cytoplasm, the mother cell cytoplasm. In other words, how does the fourth spore maintains metabolic potential to finish the developmental process? It has to be fed by the mother cell. And so the mother cell assembles an umbilical cord, which is really a channel made of many different proteins. That's the mother cell side of the channel, the fourth spore side of the channel. This complex of proteins makes a zipper that brings the two membranes together and is used for the mother cell to feed the spore. So we don't really know yet what goes through the channel, through this channel or umbilical cord. What we know is that if you look at enzymes of the Krebs cycle, for example, aconitase and malate dehydrogenase, aconitase here, malate dehydrogenase, and that's the Krebs cycle. We're really looking at the beginning and the end of the cycle. That's pyruvate dehydrogenase, which provides the cycle with acetyl-CoA. And you can see that by fusing the genes for aconitase and malate dehydrogenase to GFP, that expression of these two genes, and presumably of the entire Krebs cycle, is confined to the mother cell. It's excluded from the fourth spore. So one of the hypotheses is that what goes through the fourth spore, through the channel that the mother cell assembles, are intermediates, Krebs cycle intermediates, that allow the fourth spore to maintain metabolic potential during the differentiation process. Okay, there's a huge diversity of spore formers, and as a last example on now an application, this strain here called BSP1 was sold to a company a few years ago because it looked like a very promising probiotic. Okay. And the reason was that the supernatant of a culture of that strain had a very potent killing activity against a panel of other bacteria, some of which are pathogens that you can find in the human gastrointestinal tract. And so it would kill bacteria very quickly by by inducing discontinuities in the membrane. Okay, so in fact we identified this molecule, the cyclic peptide called subtilosin A, and our strain was making a lot more of it than a normal lab strain. And this is my last slide, just to show you that as an example of a molecule that some of these spore forming bacteria can make and affect the composition of the microbiota. Here is one. This subtilosin A bacteriocin is able to kill a wide panel of other bacteria, including some other gut bacteria. And in that group, there are several important pathogens. Okay, that's my overview of things we do in the lab, more related to the topic of this grant.